Welcome back to Exodus Brothers, where we explore what happens when faith unravels and what comes next.
Today's episode is a special one. We are joined by an old friend and former neighbor, Michael Harris, lead singer of the alternative rock duo Idiot Pilot. Michael is someone we grew up with, who knows firsthand what it's like to come of age inside a high-control religious environment.
Michael, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Michael, can you describe what your religious upbringing looked like, what kind of home environment you were raised in when it came to faith and spirituality?
Yeah, I suppose, I'd have to start at the beginning. I'm the eldest of three siblings. I have a brother Josh and a sister Laura. The three of us grew up, I suppose you'd call it a non-denominational religious setting, so no particular religious affiliation. But we went to a church by the name of Abundant Life. Yeah, my experience with religion early on was fairly tumultuous, I would say. My father was, he was involved in the church in some ways. He wasn't properly an elder or pastor, but he would perform parables and do featured sermons and things of the like. So I have some memories of that as a youngster and him practicing those parables and things at home. The interesting thing being, of course, that like my father, while being a practicing religious person, was also like inherently violent and an alcoholic. So there was a lot of abuse in the home. So from a very early age, I just sort of saw this sort of hypocrisy and dichotomy of, someone who's promoting a religion of peace and love. But, when the doors are closed and no one's around is, doing the exact opposite of the things that they're preaching and speaking about. So very quickly, I became very suspicious of just religion in general and never really felt super connected to it as a child and had a lot of just ugly experiences in the homestead, I would say.
Can you paint a picture of what it felt like to be in that household with your father and the way he was at that time?
Well, it's an interesting thing because I would basically define my childhood as basically an environment that was fear-driven. So it's not just the sort of religious overtones of, that there's spiritual warfare and angels and demons everywhere. I was also just like deathly afraid of my father himself. So there was just a lot of fear in the environment. I remember as a small child, like he would come home late from wherever he was, and I would just kind of like pretend to be asleep if I wasn't. It was an environment of avoidance, capitulation, and just like general fear. I don't have a ton of memories from super early on of the actual violence, although there are some examples I can recall. I mean, I think one day I came home from class in kindergarten. My elementary school at the time was just down the street. We lived just a few blocks away from the school, and I came home from class one day, and my mom was in her bedroom, and she had like a bloody nose and a black eye, and I think I was only 5 years old at the time or so, 5 or 6, and I don't really remember how that conversation went. It was so long ago, but I just remember thinking, gosh, what happened? And, dad was angry about something. And so it was just one of those things where you're sort of being brought up in an environment where you're just inherently told to be fearful of most everything. And then the added layer of just domestic violence and abuse. And me being the oldest of the three, I definitely experienced some semblance of that physical violence as well. But not as much as, say, just, I guess, demonstrative violence. So, throwing things against walls, yelling, and, the breaking of toys and smashing of objects, and just in general, just physical demonstrative activity that really was just unsettling and just, created an environment of just like fear-based everything. I mean, I was so afraid of like even simple things. I know it's not necessarily unusual for kids to be, quote unquote, afraid of the dark or something, but I feel like if you grow up in a religious background, the dark represents something innately more sinister, you're being told, than just, say, the darkness itself. I mean, you are told that there are spirits and demons and there's spiritual warfare happening in all these places. And so you're just constantly on edge and afraid of everything. It's a very poisonous environment, and I think it's very detrimental to the psychology of children.
Do you feel like your father was pushing religion on you at that point, alongside that domestic violence?
I don't recall an inherent pushiness. I think it's just a function of like when you are born into that environment, it's just sort of assumed that that's reality, that that's truth, and that that's what you do. So I did not start questioning per se until probably closer to adolescence. I think in the years I'm sort of referencing now of early childhood, it's just sort of like that's just the reality that you know. So there's no question of like, do you want to participate or not? It's this is what we do, is we go to church. Halloween in general was something that we were not allowed to celebrate or participate in. And I do have memories of in that same house around age 5, 6 through 7, 8. I think we lived in that house for 3 or 4 years. That like when trick-or-treaters were coming, my dad would turn off all the lights and he would be kind of on edge. And it was just like, yeah, it was definitely something that we were not allowed to participate in. And ironically, even once my dad was out of the picture some years later, I still had a very unusual relationship with Halloween in general. And I think we can touch on that a little bit later as far as the latent effects of indoctrination and kind of like what effects that has on your thinking, even once you've decided that you don't believe in the things you've been told are true your entire life. There's interesting after effects. So yeah, Halloween was definitely not something we were allowed to observe in any capacity for sure, my entire childhood.
Yeah, that was the case for us as well. It wasn't until later on, and I had my own kids, that I finally allowed them to go trick or treating, for example. And it was a fun experience. I got to live vicariously through them and experience that, and that was kind of a cool experience to have. But very similar sounding environment. At one point, your family moved in with another household under the idea of getting closer to God. That sounds like a pretty intense shift. What was the reasoning behind that, and how did that experience affect you?
Well, the timeline is admittedly a bit messy. The household that you're referencing was owned by a woman that was a active part of the church we grew up attending. And it was her and her sister that were sort of operating this house under the guise of essentially, it was called the Liberty Street House. And it was a function of basically they took in families that were in need, and not just families, maybe singular individuals that found themselves in relationship with the church that just needed a leg up. Maybe they just needed a roof over their head, somewhere safe to be if they were in transition. So the reason I say the timeline is kind of messy is because we actually ended up living with them on and off over the years for different periods of time. The first time that we moved into this house with these two elderly women that were running this theoretically charitable operation out of their home, my father was already out of the picture. We had moved to Arkansas with him one year when I was about 9 years old. That's a whole era of things that happened, but essentially he got into a car accident where he almost died, and he was in a coma for a while. And then once he was out of the hospital and allowed to come back to the home with the family, once he came to from the coma and began regaining physical ability, he became exponentially more violent than he ever was. And that was sort of the impetus and motivating factor for my mom to actually finally get us out of there and move back to Washington. So upon returning to Washington, where we had grown up for the majority of our lives, we moved in with these two ladies. And yes, the premise was essentially we needed a place to stay, and it was all sort of under the umbrella of, Christian values. So when we moved into the house, it was awesome to have the stability of a home, but there were a lot of rules, some I would argue that were fairly arbitrary. I wasn't allowed to listen to many kinds of music. We certainly weren't allowed to read many types of literature. And the agreement being, of course, that we would regularly attend church and be active within the Abundant Life family, if you will. So yeah, it was an interesting experience. They were close to us, and I kind of still view them as sort of honorary grandmothers, if you will. But ultimately, when I look back on the premise of those relationships, I think ultimately they were harmful and were fairly frustrating for a young kid who found himself, falling in love with books and music and culture, and not being able to participate in any semblance of what I was seeing around me as far as what other children were allowed to be exposed to and participate in. So I'm sure you also share some of those same frustrations within your childhood and your upbringing of not being allowed.
Absolutely.
What was the ultimate goal of moving into this home with this family?
Well, again, it was a long time ago, and I just think that it was a function of my mom being a single mom, 3 kids, just was not able to financially sustain having a place of our own. So it was basically a landing place in a transitional sort of period where eventually she did, I think, find work of some kind. I couldn't recall what she was doing at the time, but the premise was, yeah, basically like we were a family in need. We needed to be taken care of. And the ladies that operated the house were more than willing to do so if the conditions of strengthening a relationship with quote unquote God was happening. I will say, now that we're talking about it, I do have some very vivid memories of one of the two sisters in question. I'll keep them anonymous out of respect, but one of the two ladies was a fervent prayer, if you will. She was very scheduled and regimented about her prayer sessions. And I have these vivid memories. She would basically go into her bedroom. And I mean, a lot of people in their minds, they think of prayer as this sort of silent or quiet, sort of meek approach to a, internal or proposed external conversation with a deity or God, if you will. But her prayers were very vocal, very loud, and sometimes there was music involved and lots of physical movement. I mean, you could just hear it. Just sounded like a like a prayer party in there. And I remember just thinking, gosh, this is just the strangest thing. But she was so into it. And her and her sister, they just believed so fervently that you kind of had no option, but you just could not argue with what was happening in that house. And so yeah, it's interesting to reflect on for sure. I'm almost positive they're probably still active in that same church and still observing the same customs and practices. It's interesting because, as you referenced at the beginning of the episode, we all grew up near each other. So you guys lived on the same street. So it's just fascinating to think that as children, we didn't realize amongst each other what kinds of experiences we were having that were similar or dissimilar, but still centered around this idea of suppression and indoctrination. It's very fascinating to hear your guys' story. And yeah.
Same. It's interesting to have these experiences and not really know what each other were going through at that time, but sharing that same experience in a way.
Yeah.
I think we probably met, 1994?
I didn't do the math in my head before we started the podcast, but yeah, that sounds about right. Early 90s would be about right, because that's actually probably spot on, because I was born in 85. And like I said, when we had been dragged to Arkansas that 1 year, I think we were there for about a year before we finally escaped my father, as I like to put it. When we came back to Washington, I was about 9 years old. So that would have been about 94. That sounds about right.
Yeah, exactly. So apparently you took a trip to Disneyland, went to California, and visited a bunch of churches along the way. What was that experience like, and how did that impact your belief system?
Absolutely. So I'll just preface it by saying that this is kind of an extension of what we were just discussing with the Liberty Street house and these two elderly women that were taking care of us over the years. Effectively, once my mom was able to afford our own place, we moved into some apartment buildings at the top of the same street. So we were not living in residence at that house anymore. Some years go by. We're obviously still in contact. They're just down the street. But we stopped attending church and we're not being regularly active in Abundant Life anymore. So at one point, one of the sisters that was running that house decided to relocate back to Arizona. So she had moved away, and she hit me up one day and basically just said, "Hey, I've been thinking of you. God is speaking to me." These are familiar phrases. "And I'd really like to have you come down and visit and essentially take you to all the places that I know you never got to go to as a child." So as you said, Disneyland, SeaWorld, San Diego Zoo, and then obviously under the umbrella of let's get you reconnected with God. Let's strengthen that relationship with God and reintegrate you into the church. And me being a young kid, I was tempted and accepted the invitation just based off, well, I'll get to go to all these fun places. So what could be the harm? Interestingly enough, there is a lot of things that occurred on that trip that are quite messy. And we could talk about that for sure. But yeah, essentially the idea was to take this long trip and visit all these wonderful places and stop at some churches along the way. Interestingly enough, one of the churches we went to, MC Hammer was doing a sermon. I think it was his church, actually. So I have seen MC Hammer preach.
I wasn't aware he did that sort of a thing.
Yes.
So can you talk about some of the specific experiences you had on that trip, especially what it was like visiting the churches?
Absolutely. The churches, I don't have a ton of memory about like specific churches beyond the MC Hammer one. That was just obviously stuck out in my mind as a kid. I'm like, wow, that's MC Hammer. That's interesting. But there is also a church that I remember us visiting in Arizona. And the only memory I have of this place was that the parking lot at night, because you're in the desert, was littered with bugs. So when you would walk through the parking lot, it was like you would hear this crunching sound. I don't have much recollection of many of the sermons. I will talk about the last church we visited for sure, because that was definitely a moment where the decision was made for me internally that I was done with pursuing God in any form or fashion.
Do you remember what kind of sects these were? What denominations?
No, I don't remember. I would be hard pressed to remember that. Yeah, so long ago.
Was there speaking in tongues or that sort of behavior?
Absolutely, there was definitely, as was typical of the church that I had grown up in. So I had already been accustomed to seeing these sorts of things of the speaking in tongues. And gosh, what do you call it when, everybody comes up to the front at the end and then they're sort of praying over you and tapping you on the head and you're supposed to fall down? I don't know if there's a proper terminology for that.
Slain in the spirit.
Yeah, slain in the spirit. Thank you, Jake.
Yeah, so it sounds like very evangelical, charismatic, that kind of category.
Very much so. Yeah, we weren't doing a tour of the Catholic churches, which I have attended once in my early 20s just for funsies. I wanted to see what the vibe was in there, and it is much different than what I grew up surrounded by.
Ritualistic.
Yes, very ritualistic and kind of boring. So one of the peculiar occurrences of this trip that I took, so as I alluded to earlier, obviously not being allowed to listen to certain music or read certain literature, but it having some time passed since I was under the stewardship of these ladies in their household, I actually did bring some music of my own on this trip. I think I had some Tool records and some Marilyn Manson records and things of the like. CDs, of course. Back then it was CDs. And I also brought some Stephen King books and just some literature, some horror-themed literature that I was really into at the time, being about 13 or 14 years old or so. So I bring this stuff on the trip, and immediately the woman is she's already sort of uncomfortable, but she recognizes that, me being an adolescent and she's not truly my parent, that, she has to leave some wiggle room for me to participate in these things. So, but the whole trip, I'm sort of being further indoctrinated and told that, well, you got to be careful with these things because you're opening yourself up. This is a popular phrase that's used. You're opening yourself up to demonic, presence and infiltration. So as you're being sort of beat about the brow psychologically about the things you're reading or listening to, it does, even as an adolescent, have an effect. So I have a crazy story. So we're staying at this house, and I have this vivid memory where I was reading my Stephen King book before bed, and I had a Tool record on in the background as I'm reading the book. And as you know, Tool songs and Maynard, sometimes vocally, he'll do some very interesting sort of guttural and breathy sort of vocalizations that are kind of animalistic. So I'll relay the story and then I'll tell you my interpretation of it afterwards. But effectively, what I thought happened was that as I was trying to go to sleep, and once I turned the music off and put the book down, I was laying in bed and I suddenly felt that I was aware of a demonic presence in the room. I just could perceive that there was something in the room that was watching me, and I could hear breathing. And I remember laying there sort of mortified and thinking, oh my gosh, is it happening? Is this the thing that they've always been telling me about? Have I opened myself up here? And as I'm laying on the bed, as I recall, I do remember physically feeling a set of hands at the foot of the bed, and this thing sort of approaching and getting closer. I don't recall what happened immediately after that. I think I was just trying to pretend I was asleep in my own mind. What I have realized since, and with some research, is that I was indeed asleep the entire time and was experiencing what they call sleep paralysis. So because of the music and the book and the climate of sort of what I was being fed psychologically to be true, I just basically had a sleep paralysis experience that I, because of the environment that I was in, was being told was reality, that there was actually a demon that I had allowed into the house. Because inevitably, once that situation came to a close, I jumped out of bed and ran down the hallway to the bedroom that the nice woman who had taken me on this trip was staying in. And I said, oh my gosh, you have no idea what just happened and all this stuff. And she's, of course, like, oh, well, we've got to get up and we've got to pray. And where's your Stephen King book? And I remember we jumped in the car with my Stephen King book and drove to like a Jack in the Box and threw it in the dumpster in the back of a Jack in the Box or a Burger King or something. So it was this whole experience of just basically like, it felt like a moment during the trip where I was like, oh, well, maybe there is some validity to this. Maybe this is the truth. Maybe this is reality, that there is demons and angels and spiritual warfare happening surrounding my life and my decisions. So that was an interesting moment about halfway through the trip that I can recall very vividly.
So ultimately, what did you come away feeling after this trip? Where were you at emotionally or mentally?
Yeah, so basically, with the premise of the trip being, let's get you reconnected with your relationship with God, and going through the experiences that I did, I had this vivid memory of being at the last church on the stop. That last couple days of that trip, we went to this church, and it was a very big church. I do remember that it was quite sizable. I mean, they even had like 2 stories. So it was like auditorium style, almost like a theater situation, if you will. I can't remember the name of the church or the city we were in. But at the end of the service, as is pretty typical, you have the pastor up front say, okay, now anybody that wants to come up front can do so. And let's pray over you. Let's get you, if it's your first time, asking God into your heart, I think is what they say. Or if you're, still questioning, you want to reconnect, just come up front. If you want to, just please come up front as they often do. And so I said, well, this is the end of the trip. This is our last church stop. I basically internally decided I'm going to go up there and I'm going to pray so hard and I'm going to ask God to speak to me. Fast forward. So I'm up there. The pastor goes around, he kind of like prays over everybody just a little bit. And then it's kind of like you're left to your own devices. Maybe some people are being focused on by staff members and things. But essentially I had this memory of I buried my head in my lap and I was kind of like, facing forward on my haunches on these steps. And I'm just praying so hard. And I'm just saying, God, if you really are real and if this trip is what I think it is, then, just say anything, just say anything to me right now. And I'll forever follow you. I will be so in. And I'm just sitting there. I'm praying. I'm hearing nothing, obviously, just nothing. Silence. This is terrible. But at one point I finally said, you know what? I don't think God's going to speak to me. And I lifted my head up and I shit you not, there was a janitor with a vacuum that was like vacuuming the aisleways and pretty much the room had cleared. I mean, there might've been 10 or 12 odd people lingering around, but it was clear that they had just let me be there for however many freaking minutes I was up there, just fervently asking God to speak to me. And it was interesting. I walked away from that particular night and that particular experience just knowing that I did not believe and that this was a total waste of my time and that I was done with trying to connect with this God people kept trying to convince me was real. So that was a very pivotal moment. And then I think I have a vague recollection of when I was about to go to the airport, maybe to go home after that trip, sitting in the car with the woman who had provided this opportunity for me. And she asked me kind of point blank, what do you think? And how do you feel? And I just was honest and said, I really appreciate the opportunity to go to all these wonderful places and experience these just like childhood, just dream scenarios that I never got to have as a kid who grew up in the home I did. But I got to tell you, I don't think God is for me. And I don't remember what her reaction was. I think it was pretty nonplussed. I don't think she was overly concerned with it, but that was the moment I knew that I was done with trying to have a relationship with God, quote unquote.
And what age were you at that point?
I want to say that was about 13-ish, 14 maybe. Yeah, about that window. And as I said, unfortunately, it still took many more years of deprogramming to let go of some of those intrinsic fear-based beliefs that can haunt your everyday. But that was the moment that I knew I didn't believe and was never going to.
You've been open about experiencing abuse growing up. How did you process that as a kid, or did you process that in any way? And how do you make sense of it now with religion being tied into it?
Well, I don't think I actually began the process of working through and recognizing the effects of the traumas I experienced until my mid to late 20s. Admittedly, during my early adulthood, I feel that I was probably in denial about a lot of things, or maybe had convinced myself that I had processed through those things. But realistically, with the use of alcohol and drug use and just distractions of different natures, I find that probably I didn't really start addressing those traumas until much later in life, realizing who I was internally and how that manifested externally. So like in my relationships and things, I don't think that I was super cognizant of my behavior at times and how I came across to other people, how I treated other people. And these are all journeys that all of us do, regardless of religious upbringings or not. But for me, I think it was kind of a slow burn and took a long time. I think a lot of what religion does, as I said, is even if you decide to walk away, quote unquote, from the church, there's a lot of latent sort of effects psychologically and emotionally, things that you carry with you. I mean, I think that's why they call it deprogramming, right? You have to literally deprogram. So it took a lot of soul searching, a little bit of therapy. Actually, I think the best thing for me growing up, once I was outside of the church, was just having conversations with friends and peers who were not of the church, who did not grow up in those backgrounds, kind of intellectually sparring with me, if you will, and just sort of forcibly, repeatedly asking questions of me of, well, why do you believe that? Why do you assume that to be reality? And those kinds of conversations are of so much importance to starting to deprogram and actually analyze, well, why do I hold on to this? Why am I holding on to these beliefs that are not serving me and are ultimately detrimental to my relationships with other people?
Was there a specific person or anyone in the community who helped break you out of that or set you on the path you're on now?
Absolutely. And it might be appropriate to mention him right away, but I was in a band for a time called Idiot Pilot that we had started around high school. And my bandmate, Daniel Anderson, and some other friends, Dan Rude, shout out Dan Rude. I have vivid memories of having conversations with those two in particular. And they were very instrumental in pushing me as a thinker and as an intellectual to question the sort of inherent belief systems that I had been programmed into thinking were material reality. I remember a specific conversation that was very frustrating for me where they were talking about, and it's maybe a cliche at this point, but the whole argument about the hand through the wall, who's to say that after a million tries that I couldn't put my hand through this wall? And I said, well, no, you can never put your hand through the wall. That'll never happen molecularly or otherwise. And they said, well, how do you know? And it's just an interesting exercise in like, you cannot assume any reality. Reality is always shifting. It's ever changing. And, it's just a semblance of probabilities, however unlikely. So yeah, conversations like that maybe aren't even centered around religion, but push you as an intellectual to consider alternate ways of thinking.
Yeah. So the band you formed, Idiot Pilot, you formed it when you were still a teenager and it really took off. How did the band come together, and what was the driving sound or the overall message behind your music?
Idiot Pilot was actually not the first incarnation of a music group that I was active in as a youngster. My bandmate Daniel Anderson and I had been in various little 4-piece bands throughout middle school and into high school. And we had actually known each other, I think, since about 4th or 5th grade. So we'd grown up in the same town and knew each other for the majority of our lives. But Idiot Pilot was essentially a function of, after being in a few different bands, we realized that him and I were the only two kids that were actually serious about music and wanted to pursue it professionally and as a career. So Idiot Pilot was basically a conversation between the two of us saying, all right, well, we're done with these bass players and drummers and things. Let's just start a project that's just the two of us, and we'll come up with a concept and we'll go from there. So we literally just sat, I think, in his living room or his kitchen at one point and kind of discussed what we wanted to do sonically, what we wanted to do conceptually. And what we arrived at was that we wanted our music to be a marriage between, humanistic elements and mechanical elements. I mean, mind you, this is the, early 2000s. So it's kind of before internet and technology was really just synonymous with everything. It was not quite as ubiquitous. So the idea was that we would incorporate a laptop and electronic tracks in conjunction with live vocals and guitar work and bass work. And, it's funny, I think about it now and I'm like, it doesn't sound horribly original. At the time, it was sort of original as an idea, and it was certainly an exercise in like genre play. So we did not restrict ourselves to any certain type of music. We wanted to basically just throw a bunch of paint at the wall and then see what would stick. So it was super fun. It was great. It was an outlet, certainly, for a lot of these things that we're talking about, of just, I had a lot of childhood trauma and abuse and just like crazy experiences. So I certainly had much to talk about even at a young age, lyrically through my music. So it was great to have that outlet for sure.
Yeah, I thought it was really original. So you guys signed with Reprise and worked with some major names at the time. What was it like being that young and suddenly thrust into the music industry at such a high level? And were some of the songs a way of channeling your religious upbringing?
I think inherently I probably was. I'd have to go back and look at like specific lyrics and things to see if there are references to the religious upbringing. But in general, there was definitely a lot of angst and existential dread. And certainly as a lyricist, I found myself stylistically to operate kind of in the abstract, but also with like layers that I would discover years later. It's an interesting thing as a lyricist. Sometimes you don't even know what you're writing about when you're writing it. And then you might encounter that song 15 years later and go, oh, that's what I was talking about. So to me, music is awesome because it taps into that subconscious that you don't readily have access to. And even if it's not apparent where it's coming from at the moment, it's constantly revealing itself to you. Musically, yeah, it was hard to be operating on the level that we were and not seeing much success come our way. I think there was a lot of frustration with the artistic process, not between the two of us per se, but just with relating to audiences. I think that what we were doing when we started was kind of unique in the sense that when we played live, it would just be the two of us on a laptop. And that was an unusual presentation. We did not have live drums or bass. And the music itself was, kind of, again, an interesting mix of many different genres kind of being thrust into one sort of streamlined set. So yeah, over the years, it gained us some notoriety and was a cool story. Two kids in the basement with a laptop making crazy tunes. And it definitely got us a record deal. But I found that over the years, my role in the band was pushing towards more of a live band aesthetic and kind of both of us deciding to up the production level. Overall, the experience in the industry, I would say, was very chaotic and frustrating and probably caused me a lot of stress. The music industry is notorious for just eating artists alive. And while we did maintain integrity artistically and we never compromised our morals or our views as far as what we were trying to accomplish, we definitely hit a lot of roadblocks and had a lot of problems with industry staffers and trying to find where we fit in the music world as far as trying to promote the project. So yeah, it was a long, tumultuous ride.
Let me ask you this. When you listen back to your older work now, do you ever hear things in the lyrics or songs that reveal where you were emotionally or mentally at the time, even if you didn't recognize it back then?
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like I had one of these the other week and now I'm trying to recall it because it definitely does happen where you listen back to a lyric that maybe on paper doesn't really make sense. One of my favorite lyricists growing up was Isaac Brock from Modest Mouse. And one thing that I love about Isaac is that in his lyrics, he's always dabbling in, I guess what you'd call like irony or something, where it's like he'll use terminology and juxtapose like, dialectical ideas, like freezing fire is a dumb example, but two opposites being sort of contextualized together in a lyric. And that was a trick that I really liked and appreciated. So I used that quite a bit. I think one of our most popular songs early on was A Day in the Life of a Pool Shark. And in the chorus, I say, don't know how long the fallout will last, but we'll find the higher ground. And when you really examine that lyric, well, I think if there's fallout happening, you want to go underground. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think higher ground's pretty dangerous. But it's interesting because I just sort of intrinsically love to dabble in opposites and contradiction. When I think about that lyric now, I wonder if I wasn't actually not addressing any material physical fallout, but rather a relationship that maybe is suffering due to vanity or, not being able to recognize the value in someone else. And once there is fallout in that relationship, making attempts to find the higher ground and know when to walk away in a way that's healthy. I don't know. I could just be making that up off the top of my head right now, but it's interesting to go back to lyrics and assign different meanings. And I think meaning changes over time, no matter what the art is. So that's the best part about art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I find it interesting. It's almost like a Rorschach test of your past self. At the time, you might not have fully understood where it was coming from, but looking back now, certain patterns or meanings start to reveal themselves in ways that make sense,
Yeah, I guess it boils down to my writing process with Daniel for the majority of Idiot Pilot was never intentional in the sense of like, I rarely sat down to write a song with an idea already in mind about what I wanted to speak about. I was not much of a quote unquote storyteller. You think of your Connor Obersts and guys like that are just like constantly telling stories. Bob Dylan's, whatever. But I'm not a storyteller. I was just more of like an abstract painter, and just using words that I thought phonetically were pleasing or sounded good. And that actually worked out. I think for the most part, I look back on like the songs that we did, and I'm proud of them. And there's a couple moments of lyrical silliness, but in general, I think that the mood and the emotion behind the words is more important anyway. And tying it back to what we're talking about is just that, like, I had just a wealth of emotional stuff to get out based on this, these childhood experiences and through adolescence that were just like not necessarily the norm and were full of baggage. So, yeah.
Yeah. With lyrics that are more abstract, it seems like that enables people to kind of pull their own meaning from those as well and their own interpretations of the song and have that relate to them. So that's kind of cool too, that people are able to pull their own meanings in lyrics or even in movies, things like that, that you can make your own thing out of it, basically.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that the best art allows for the I don't want to say consumer, anti-capitalist here, but the participant in the art, the viewing of it, the listening of it, the experiencing of it to assign their own meanings, I think is just astronomically valuable and is the whole point of art, with some notable exceptions. Political art comes to mind.
So how did your past and the pressure or the pain of it show up while you were touring or recording and navigating success at a young age in that band?
This is a great question, Jake. It manifested in some really interesting ways, and in some ways that admittedly I'm sort of embarrassed to reflect on and talk about, but for the sake of entertainment value and clicks, let's get into it. I just think that, as I alluded to earlier, with not necessarily processing my trauma in any true like academic or a therapeutic sense, music providing an outlet, sure, to a point, but also experiencing just additional frustrations within trying to survive in the music industry and the complications that come with being in a band and being intimate and close to someone for prolonged periods of time. It manifested in some pretty ugly ways. I think that with the frustration of audiences not understanding the music right away, and it not translating into merch sales and things, there was definitely a sort of attitude that I was employing on stage as a live performer that was fairly antagonistic. I think that some of that was internalized trauma coming out messily on stage in front of people. I don't know how much of that is childhood stuff or just the frustration of the moment itself as, trying to be a burgeoning artist that wants recognition. I mean, any artist that tells you they don't want recognition for what they're doing is probably full of shit. And I wanted recognition for what we were doing. And when I wasn't receiving that, I didn't have a healthy way of dealing with it. So I think actually there is hopefully not much footage of those tantrums and things, but there was definitely some vocalizations over the microphone that, when I hear tale of what I said, or if I hear audio of some of the things that I said on stage, I am just aghast at myself. But giving grace for the fact that I was in my early 20s and not quite an adult just yet, and was given a little more freedom to speak than maybe I deserved or should have been allowed to. But yeah, it definitely manifested in some pretty interesting ways, specifically with touring. And then, of course, over the course of time, when you're having frustration and not necessarily in front of the right audiences and not necessarily getting packaged with the right bands, that frustration becomes internalized. So then it starts getting taken out on, your bandmates and the people that are around you trying to support you. So eventually the thing just sort of corroded, I guess, over time. And we decided to walk away and have a divorce, if you will, as a band. I have regrets about it, but ultimately it was a learning experience, and we made some great art and we touched some people's lives in some pretty tangible and meaningful ways. And that was the whole point of what we were doing anyway. It was just, music saved me as someone who grew up in a indoctrination environment and abusive and fear-based. Music as an outlet was a literal savior. Jesus Christ is not my savior. Music was my savior. And I can say that confidently.
I feel that. I think art is one of the greatest things we can do in life. And I'm curious, do you still write music these days? And if so, what does your creative process look like? And how has that evolved from when you first started out?
If I'm being honest, I don't really write songs anymore and haven't for some years. I have a post-rock instrumental band with my brother, and we play music that has no vocals, so no lyrics. As far as, writing of songs with lyrics or written concepts, I'm not exercising that muscle in that arena. I am, however, attending school for the first time since those early 2000s when we signed a record deal and went straight on the road. So I didn't even finish high school. In my curriculums and classes that I'm taking, I'm finding that I'm reconnecting with myself as a writer and using the prompts in certain classes that I'm being given to write about any given social issue. And that's been a nice way to flex that quote unquote creative muscle. It's not quite the same, obviously, but just getting reconnected with the written word, my abilities as a writer has been really refreshing. And I hope that if I do a future Idiot Pilot project or something else that involves lyrics and singing, that writing process will have an effect on the art. And perhaps I will start to write a little more intentionally as I become an older artist.
Totally a new phase. I love it.
Yeah.
What does healing look like for you now, outside of art and therapy and stuff like that? What are some other ways that you found to sort of heal or heal your inner child?
Healing to me, my personal connection with that word at the moment, it makes me think of my choice to practice sobriety is a big one. So I no longer lean on substances to alter how I'm feeling. By extension, because of sobriety, I find that my relationships that I maintain and care for have become just deeper and better. I feel more present as a person. I think healing, I'm just not sure that trauma is something that ever like goes away. I don't think it ever leaves. I think you just change your relationship with it and no longer let yourself be a victim to it. It's interesting because the people in my life that I find sometimes I have frustration with, maybe they suffer from that. Maybe they just still have a victim mentality and are still holding on to things in a way that is not serving them. I mean, I'm not saying that anyone should ever be in denial of what happens to them, but to me, healing looks like, I don't want to say making peace, but just recognizing that you are your own person, you have autonomy, and that the way that you move forward informs your reality. So just being more present, being mindful, and not trying to suppress things, but also not reliving and living inside of them constantly. So it's a delicate balance. I don't know if it ever truly happens.
I like how you said that. I think it's true. I think you just learn how to have a better relationship with it, like you said. How have your views on religion or belief evolved over the years, or is it something you've completely left behind? How do you view it now?
Solid question. How do I view religion now?
Be honest.
Yeah, I want to be the guy that says, well, life's up for interpretation, and if you have beliefs, and you got to respect people's beliefs and things. But honestly, I just think religious thinking is a poison, and I think it's one of the most harmful things that humanity has ever built for itself. I think we see all sorts of repercussions having directly to do with religious thinking and modalities. The self-fulfilling prophecy of revelations and global war. I just see all these things happening in the political arena and in the economic arena and in the global social structure that's just like inherently messy, violent, lots of death and suffering. And I think religion is a direct contributor to a lot of those sort of unfortunate aspects of the world that we live in as opposed to could live in. I don't know. I don't have much patience for it, and I don't really have conversations with religious people. I think if they start talking in those ways, I just kind of like shut off. I'm just not interested in entertaining people's delusions, at least not of that brand. Everybody has delusions, obviously, but if we're talking religion, I'm probably disinterested in the conversation.
Yeah, more harmful than helpful.
Absolutely. But, if that's what helps you get through, I don't know.
Well, especially as we've seen from childhood, where people are indoctrinated and it's about control and domination and a way to keep people compliant and keep them from asking questions. You're saying that we've figured out all the answers and these are the answers and we can't actually get our questions answered. That's where it really becomes problematic. And when you impose that religion on others and try and force that on them, and like you said, in the political arena, same thing when it's used to control and dominate. And that's kind of what we see today with Christian nationalism. That is definitely, you can see the harm that's directly caused from that.
It's a huge issue right now, and I don't see it going away anytime soon, unfortunately. But just, yeah, I mean, fundamentalism in any regard, but yeah, Christian nationalism is just a virus that's infected the American populace, I think, and we definitely are in dire need of deprogramming as a society. And yeah, it shuts down critical thinking, as you said, and just allows for people to get away with just the nastiest, ugliest things.
Yeah, and it's only intensified from the Reagan era to now. We've seen an even greater consolidation of power and control.
And if I'm not mistaken, we don't have to get too far into it, but I do believe that some of the separations of church and state are being eradicated at this very moment. So it's very concerning.
Yeah, we talked in our last episode about how the 10 Commandments are not being mandated in schools in Texas, etc.
What would you say to someone who is listening, who's coming out of a similar background, that grew up in fear, and they're trying to reclaim their identity? What would you say to them?
Well, I would say that there's plenty of things to be afraid of in life, but demons and angels ain't one of them. No, I don't know. I don't know what I would say. I think that everybody's experience is unique and individual. I think it's just important to recognize that just because you were told that something is the truth and that something is reality doesn't make it so, and that it's okay to explore other avenues of thinking and other interpretations and definitions of what existence even means, and that they should feel comfortable in exploring identity and exploring relationships and exploring philosophies. There is no right answer, but there's a few, I think, distinctly wrong ones. And any answer that's wrong is, as we know, is something that tells you that you're inherently not of value, and that if you don't serve the Father, you're not loved. It's just a poisonous message.
Yeah, exactly. And that you're inherently sinful or fundamentally flawed from birth.
You are worthy. Everyone is worthy. Everybody has value intrinsically and inherently. And any message that tells you otherwise is disgusting.
Yeah. Your default position is not to be hellbound and tortured for eternity.
Right. And we're telling kids this. Yikes.
Yeah, indeed.
Thank you guys so much for allowing me to come on here and just share my story, and just really relish the opportunity to speak with you. I really appreciate what you guys are doing with this podcast. I think it's just absolutely vital that we begin to address these things that people don't necessarily feel comfortable looking at, but ultimately is beneficial to us, not just as individuals and communities, but as a society, to start unpacking these messages that have just been assumed to be relevant for so many, hundreds of years, thousands of years. It's time to start reimagining our world, and part of that is this healing journey of unpacking these indoctrinated messages that we've been receiving. So thank you so much for allowing me to speak on it, and I look forward to future episodes, boys.
Okay, that was our conversation with Michael Harris, and we're glad he was willing to share his story with us and with you.
If you grew up in a rigid faith system, maybe parts of Michael's story felt familiar. If so, we hope this episode reminded you that you're not alone. If you've got a story to tell, we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care. Who's in the house?
JC!
Tell me who's
Jesus
in the house.
Christ is in the house
Today!
today. Maybe I was musically influenced by lukewarm Christian music.
Lukewarm for Christ.
Yeah.